Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. My name is CramWow, and today we're going to look into how to ruin an otherwise great story. For those who don't know about it, back in November in 2024, we got a World of Warcraft novella called Heartlands. It consisted of 5 chapters, and it follows the fall of Dalaran and kicks off in Boralus with Jaina and Thrall conversing about the fall of Dalaran and the ongoing war. Together, they summon the leaders of the Horde and the Alliance to Boralus in order to muster a fighting force that can defeat the current threat, Xal'atath. After the invitation was sent out, among those to show were Danath Trollbane, Thrall, Jaina, Agra, Bane, Thalisra, Kiro, Chandris Feathermoon, Umbric, Kurdran Wildhammer, and Tess Greymane. The story takes place in the Arathi Highlands, where it surfaces that Marin, Danath Trollbane's niece, is stoking tensions with the Mag'har located in Hammerfall. On the Horde side, the Orcs believe that the 7th Legion reinforcements gathered at Stromgarde were used to stoke these tensions, and that's certainly how it looked. It sparked tension between the faction leaders, but Danath quickly assured the other faction leaders that this was not the case. Danath said that they had only sent the 7th Legion reinforcements there to help bolster the kingdom after the suffering it had endured during the 4th War. Then, to rally the force, Thrall is sent to help Geara, and Danath would have Jaina go to Stromgarde to talk to his niece. Danath wouldn't join Jaina though, because he had to go back to his duties in Stormwind. When arriving in the Arathi Highlands, however, the situation was much more dire than they thought. Tensions had risen and the scene looked grim, and with the situation dire, Jaina and Thrall had to do the reparations in order to save what they could. However, before they could get their bearings, Thrall ends up being shot by an arrow, a poisoned arrow no less, and Jaina ends up having to haul Thrall to Stromgarde in an attempt to spare him a grim fate. But Thrall wasn't let in. Only Jaina was. Under the assumption that Danath's word hadn't yet reached Stromgarde, Thrall let Jaina enter alone, and he would travel back to Hammerfall. Stromgarde wasn't welcoming, but it was busy. There was more than just the 7th Legion auxiliary here. Soldiers filled the streets, outnumbering normal civilians, and houses were boarded up to weather a coming storm. Jaina then came face to face with Marin inside Stromgarde. Jaina then tries to negotiate with Marin in regards to Thrall and the war against Xal'atath, but she is met with stern reluctance and bafflement from Marin. Stromgarde, according to Marin, had been neglected by the Alliance for too long. Their supplies grow thin, their people grow weary, and with that, Marin needs help. Marin knew that Jaina wasn't here to negotiate more reinforcements, because for Marin, the Orcs had been contributing to senseless violence and invading their lands, which caused distress for Stromgarde. But in the meantime, Thrall was forcing his way, wounded and poisoned, towards Hammerfall, across the Highlands. But he is thankfully found by a scouting force, saved, and brought back to Hammerfall, where he sees Agra. Agra had bad news though. The situation hadn't eased at all, and negotiations with Geara had not gone well. Thrall insisted that he would speak with Geara, but Geara was tense, and at her side was the Corcoran General Telgar and Eitric. Geara is rightfully angry as her people got killed and massacred across the fields of the Highlands. For the entire time that the Mag'har had settled in Hammerfall, which they had done so to escape the war, they shared a common peace with the humans of Stromgarde. That was until Marin became Regent Lord. She used the 7th Legion to roam further and further into Orcish lands, and provoke them, which soon gave way to violence. Both the Corcoran General Telgar and Geara both agreed that they had no choice. Corcoran had come to help the Mag'har stave off the human incursions, which only made things worse, but Thrall could not see what Geara saw. Geara tells Thrall that Stromgarde is planning an attack on Goshek Farm, which houses non-warrior orcs, families simply seeking peace and to rebuild what they had lost on Draenor. And yet Thrall still insists on diplomacy. During all of this arguing, the bombshell is dropped that Geara and Thrall are actually siblings, and they had never talked about this ever. They share the same father, and up until this point they had never spoken about that, so it comes off as a blow to Thrall's core, because not only did Gayara know that they were siblings, but so did Agra, and neither of them had ever told Thrall about this. So Thrall, rightfully upset, wanders out from the chamber looking for some seclusion from everything that's going on, and that's when we return to Jaina's point of view. Maren and Jaina have moved into the lower levels, a secluded chamber that was originally like old Arathor, to speak in private. It's at this point that Maren starts her monologue about old Arathor and human supremacy, and she tells Jaina that her letter had been intercepted by one of Maren's best archers, like her assassin or whatever, and that career had been killed. And she throws basically the letter back at her and says, "I found this, I'm really angry." And they start bickering. And amidst the bickering, Jaina raises the point that Maren should work to uplift the Mag'har and the humans through friendship. Which, I'll be honest, it was a bit cringy when I heard it, but I didn't really stop to think too much about it or worry too much about it. I was not that big of a deal to me personally. Amidst all this, there is a really cool detail that during Maren's monologue, she actually skins a black wolf that is still wearing the harness of the Kor'kron Outriders. And then she puts on the wolf pelt over her head like a harness, and it's a fantastic monument to how good they can actually write these characters. Because her cruel and warped but fascinating personality actually really shines through here. It tells us of her conviction of what she believes and how she may have even become a bit too fanatic in what she believes. Back in Hammerfall, Thrall and Gayara reconcile after the argument that they had about not knowing that they were siblings. Eventually, a horn sounds to break their dialogue, and a raider of the Kor'kron arrives, and he mentions that the 7th Legion and the army of Strom is marching on them in an attack. Gayara pulls into a counterattack and rushes to the location of the battle, but Thrall needs to convince her to pull back as to not kickstart a 5th war between the factions, but Gayara is already long gone before Thrall realizes. The attack had been on Goshek Farm, and Gayara rushed to try and save as much as she could. Gayara saw Jaina, however, who had joined the battle in an attempt to separate the forces and keep casualties low. But Gayara believed that Jaina had joined the Maren side of conflict, and thus rushed in to stop her. Gayara had been swept up and away by an elemental conjured by Jaina, and it was here that she realized that she was no longer in Goshek Farm, but rather in a human farm. Gayara realized that the humans in this farm were not out there to fight among Maren's soldiers, but rather that they had only sought to protect their people. These people huddled into the darkness of a barn, elderly, children, and weak. She knew that this could also be happening in reverse, humans willing to confront and kill orc families for conquest and glory. Gayara and Thrall banded together. She would need a ride back to the battlefield, and Thrall offered it. Inevitably, the orcs were going to win. This was a losing war for Maren. They outnumbered the humans and were far more combat ready than the humans ever were. Jaina manages to intervene Maren and portal her some distance away from the combat before she could reach the battleground. And dialogue ensues. Meanwhile, Gayara manages to catch the attention from the combatants, and Gayara manages to yell out the command for the fighters of the Kor'kron and the Mag'har to back down, and challenged the Alliance to do the same. And being shown mercy and peace by the orcs, the Alliance soldiers folded to clasp hands with the orcs. And then there was a bunch of dialogue. Maren is locked up within Stromgarde until Danath figures out what to do with her, and it all comes to a pretty good ending. All in all, Heartlands stands as one of the finest examples of what World of Warcraft storytelling can and should be. It is a work that feels carefully crafted, richly narrated, emotionally resonant, and thematically weighty. Even though there were moments that left me questioning certain choices or details, those moments never detracted from its impact. What made Heartlands so remarkable was that it finally gave us a story that delved into the lives of both orcs and humans in a balanced and meaningful way. It wasn't another story of the next world-ending villain or the overbearing, ever-looming catastrophe that often dominates Warcraft's narrative landscape. Instead, it pulled the curtain back and gave us a glimpse of the world and its people outside of that grand spectacle. Ordinary lives, struggles, and hopes, all still deeply tied to the greater tapestry of Azeroth. That humanization, that grounding of the world, is what made Heartlands feel so refreshing and so necessary. It captured the essence of what Warcraft's writing at its best has always been about. Not simply wars and gods and demons, but the people who live in a world and the way they persevere through it all. So you're probably wondering at this point why the title of this video is How to Ruin a Great Story. Well, let me tell you. Despite how great the story was of Heartlands, Blizzard figured out a way to ruin it. I'm talking about the Legacy of Arathor. The Legacy of Arathor is a questline that released in the War Within's patch 11.1.7. It's a questline wherein we, as champion of our faction, accompany Farron, Denath, and Gaara back to the Arathi Highlands after Gaara mentions Denath's people broke their promise. In short, the story is as follows. The figure Denath left in charge in his absence tells us that Stromgarde is struggling. We find that there are banded groups such as the Defias, the Scarlet Crusade, but also the Syndicate working together under a new banner called the Red Dawn, which symbolizes human supremacy and the return to human glory and rule. These people are forcibly convincing the people of Stromgarde to stand up and join them. Races like dwarves and elves are being driven out by hatred, but no one knows where this Red Dawn is coming from and how the other groups like the Scarlet Crusade, the Defias, or the Syndicate might be connected. Well, it turns out that the Colonel Niles was in cahoots with Marin. Colonel Niles was the person who was left in charge of Stromgarde in Denath's absence. Marin was secretly staging an all-out civil war between the people who would be loyal to Denath Trollbane and people who would be loyal to the Red Dawn, aka her organization. She had attacked and stolen several incoming supply shipments from across the continent and basically sold her own city of Stromgarde short. Hammerfall even takes in human refugees who later turn out to be Syndicate and try to burn down Hammerfall while we are saving human lives from Witherbark trolls. We go back to Hammerfall, we retake it, kill the humans, and eventually find a battlefield, a scene where the orcish weapons are left behind. But these orcish weapons are not orcish weapons from the Maghar or the Korkron. These are orcish weapons from Argarok, an abandoned horde fortress closer to Stromgarde. It was the perfect staging coup for the Red Dawn, and a perfect hiding place. We go, we check it out, we take out the Red Dawn, free Denath who'd been captured, we take the fight back to Stromgarde, take out Marin, and finish the story. To which a cinematic plays where Marin is defeated by us and Farron. But instead of killing Marin, Denath intervenes and tells us to spare her, and Marin will live without her name and title. She walks off, telling us once again that it's not over and then she's never heard of again. You may have noticed that this particular storyline bears a striking resemblance to Heartlands. The problem is that it tries to echo the same beats of that story, but ends up being a hollow imitation. It is similar on the surface, but the execution is flawed beyond measure. And I want to explain why this storyline not only fails to uplive to Heartlands, but also undermines much of what made the novella so powerful in the first place. In Heartlands, she had a genuinely compelling arc, a strong presence, a woman of conviction who believed wholeheartedly in her cause. Her perspective, whether you agreed with it or not, carried weight and gave her impact. But here, in Legacy of Arathor, that same character gets stripped of her nuance and reduced to little more than a bland placeholder, quickly overshadowed by the supposed moral clarity of Farron and Denath. What's worse is that the story doesn't even commit to giving her a proper ending. There is no meaningful sacrifice, there's no impactful death, there's nothing. She just fizzles out, and her story with her. And then there's the cinematic. To put it bluntly, it might be one of the weakest Blizzard has ever produced. It lands with a thud, feeling rushed, uninspired, and wholly incapable of carrying the emotional weight that it's supposed to deliver. The larger plot lines don't fare any better. The Maghar storyline, an arc that already carried a huge dramatic weight with the loss of Draenor to the Lightbound Draenei, is undercut entirely by Farron's role. She waltzes into Hammerfall, glowing like a beacon of light, and yet no one bats an eye. It erases the stakes of the Maghar's drama and makes their suffering feel trivialized. Stromgarde itself is misrepresented in a way that betrays the established story. The narrative insists that Stromgarde and its people hold a deep hatred for non-human races, yet this flies directly in the face of their past alliances. Stromgarde fought side by side with the elves and dwarves, and they are a crucial part of that shared legacy. Now, I will go back and say, I know that it's not shown like not everybody in Stromgarde hates non-human races, or all non-human races. There are just a very loud, big minority that we see very prevalent in Stromgarde that do feel this way, because there are lots of Red Dawn loyalists. And sure, I can understand that the idea of some people being vulnerable to false promises, dreams of glory, power, or a return to greatness, that they are vulnerable to that, I get that. On paper, that can make sense, but the execution of this storyline falls flat, very flat. Take, for instance, the Scarlet Presence. Why on earth would a Scarlet Crusader even be allowed into Stromgarde? This is a group that the Alliance time and time again has treated as dangerous zealots and outright enemies, the same as the Horde. Yet here we are, watching a Scarlet casually walk into Stromgarde, spreading propaganda and hatred, and everyone just tolerates it. There's no pushback, no immediate suspicion, not even the basic question of, should we kill this guy before he starts riling people up? It makes no sense, and it doesn't stop there. The story gets more and more contrived as it goes on. Suddenly, the Defias show up. Why? Who knows? Then the Syndicate make an appearance. Why are they with the Red Dawn? Because I understand their history in the Highlands, don't get me wrong, but it just makes no sense why they would suddenly join the Red Dawn. There's no build-up to that. There's no explanation for that. It feels like the writers are pulling factions out of a hat without giving us a reason to care about their presence, let alone believe in it. What's even more baffling is the angle of propaganda itself. If the idea had been to stir up old hatreds towards Horde races, that would have worked. It would have made sense, and it would have given Stromgarde's history and the scars left by past conflicts more weight. But instead, the propaganda is aimed at sowing hatred not just against the orcs, but against other Alliance races too. Not just orcs and trolls and undead, but elves and dwarves as well. That's just not a stretch, that it actively undermines the foundation of the lore of Stromgarde. The entire questline suffers from a lack of build-up. None of these developments feel organic. They just happen, with no groundwork laid beforehand, leaving the whole story to feel contrived, abrupt, and ultimately unconvincing. At the end of the day, the whole thing feels very much like a soulless filler content, thrown together without real care for the history or context that should give it the weight it deserves. Don't get me wrong, there are positives too. For example, while I still cannot wrap my head around why the Maghar, after everything they endured on Draenor, would so casually allow someone like Farron within their walls, there is value in the story and how it attempts to engage with the land's history. That part is commendable, though it desperately needed more elaboration, more depth, and more time spent on the details. Sprinkled throughout the questline are moments that I genuinely loved, little touches of old world lore that felt authentic and impactful. Take Edric telling Farron about the Orcish internment camps. That was fantastic. It's raw. It's a humanizing moment that connects these people together, and connects also back to the painful history of this place in the Warcraft setting. But even then, the story stops short. Why doesn't she ask why these orcs were put into internment camps? Why are we not exploring that? For people who might not have played the old games or might not know the lore that well, why are we not exploring that? Why is there no light being shed on how the hatred towards the orcs was cultivated amongst the Stromgarde people, and how those attitudes linger even now. Instead, the narrative glosses over it, leaving glaring gaps that force players to fill in the blanks themselves. And assuming that kind of context isn't good storytelling, it's lazy storytelling. And this is where the frustration lies. I love the idea of there being humans who simply cannot accept the notion of living side by side with orcs. That conflict makes sense, it feels grounded, and it creates space for real drama. Having characters label those who support unity as traitors is also fantastic, because there is a genuine narrative potential here. But where the story utterly fails is in execution. You can't just conjure up a widespread movement suddenly composed of Scarlets, Syndicate, Defias, and Stromic loyalists and expect us to buy it. That kind of coalition needs build-up. What really frustrates me about this whole storyline is that it's built on two incredibly lore-rich foundations: the Mag'har and the orcs with deep roots in the region, and Stromic people with their long, storied history. These are factions with decades of narrative weight behind them, and yet their histories are barely acknowledged, let alone explored. For a narrative with this much potential being not deep and overly straightforward isn't just a missed opportunity, it's a mistake. And when you step back and look at it within the broader tapestry of World of Warcraft, 30 years of stories and conflicts and world building, it becomes clear that this isn't just mediocre, it's objectively a bad story. That's not just my take either. The reaction across forums, comment sections, and roleplay communities has been overwhelmingly negative about this questline. People aren't reading nuance into it, because there isn't nuance to be found. Instead, what we got feels like an attempt to shoehorn modern politics into a narrative that desperately demanded something more thoughtful, more in tune with Warcraft's established depth. For me personally, as someone who has cherished the orc versus human conflict for as long as I've been a Warcraft fan, this feels especially disappointing. Stromgarde, of all places, should have been handled with weight and care. This is a kingdom that's been defined by its fight against the Horde. From Warcraft 2 all the way to Battle for Azeroth, Stromgarde has a deep, rooted identity tied to that conflict. And instead of building on it, the story squandered it. And not just Stromgarde. Multiple factions were mishandled or misrepresented in ways that clash with years of established lore. It feels like no one stopped to ask whether this even aligned with what these groups of people have always been. Now, bad questlines aren't new. We've had our fair share before. The real problem here is the scale of this one. It wasn't some quiet side story tucked away in a corner. It was heavily advertised. Blizzard pushed it everywhere. YouTube, the Battle.net launcher, promotions across the board. The hype was real, because this was a very cool story that they were going to make. And then, what we got didn't just fail to live up to that hype, it outright disregarded half of what was already laid down in the Heartlands audiobook series. It neglected the histories of both the Mag'har and the Stromic, delivering one of the weakest cinematics Blizzard has ever put out, and ended on a note so flat that it drained all the soul from what should have been an emotionally charged arc. So when people ask me what my least favorite story in Warcraft is, I tell them it's the Legacy of Arathor, because it's a worse, much worse version of the Heartland story that ruins the past established story and factions related to the Highlands. Now, I say that this is like my least favorite story. There are definitely worse stories and worse characters and everything like that, but it's definitely, this is like bottom of the barrel, okay? But enough complaining, because what can we do? What could we do to fix it? What could we have done, or what could we have had instead to fix the flaws of the current Legacy of Arathor questline? First, and potentially the most obvious, is the build-up. The Legacy of Arathor questline just drops all these elements: the Scarlets, Syndicate, the Defias, Stromic hardliners. All of them enter into the story without any groundwork, and that's why it feels contrived. If there had been a proper build-up to the events of Legacy of Arathor, the whispers of the Red Dawn influencing across the Arathi Highlands, which could have been nothing more than murmurs in questlines across Khazar and things like that, then when factions finally coalesce, it would feel like a natural boiling point instead of a random grab bag of villains. Second, you need to respect the histories of the factions involved. Stromgarde has been locked in conflict with the Horde for decades. Their resentment should be directed outward, not inward at their own allies. A more authentic storyline would have leaned into Stromgarde's mistrust of orcs and their allies, framing it as, "We've bled too much to ever forgive them." That gives the propaganda actual teeth, rather than the nonsensical angle of turning them against elves and dwarves, who they literally fought beside for generations. Likewise with the Mag'har, after their trauma on Draenor at the hands of the Lightbound, letting a shining beacon of light, so to speak of it, like Farron, stroll into their stronghold should have been a huge narrative moment that could have sparked debates, tension, and even violent opposition within their own walls. Instead, it's ignored, and a golden opportunity for character conflict is lost. Another point is Maren. Make Maren matter. Instead of reducing her to a throwaway character overshadowed by Danath and Farron, the questline could have positioned her as a genuine ideological rival. Her conviction in Stromgarde's purity and independence could have been written as a foil to Danath's pragmatism, giving her a real choice to make, like sacrifice, betrayal, or just something, is far more impactful than simply letting her fade away. Also, use the old world lore with more depth. The moment where Eitrig recalls the orc internment camps is fantastic, but it stops short. Imagine if the questline had delved into the reasons those camps existed, and how Stromgarde in particular was shaped by the hatred for orcs during that time. And next is also the cinematic, and this is also the last point. The cinematic in general is the least of their worries. If the story had been impactful, if the story had been good, no one would have really cared about the poor production value of this particular cinematic. But this cinematic is so bad, and so is the story, that it is the story being good and the cinematic being bad would have been fine, but having the story be bad and the cinematic also being bad is like a magnifying glass on how bad everything really is. I think personally it is a real shame that Blizzard struggled with this questline, as it was important and held weight not just to a certain character or to a certain place, but to two very important factions that have existed and been a great part of World of Warcraft's story, some even dating back to the RTS games. Thrall should have been part in this questline, and he should have talked to Farron, and he should have been the diplomatic person who, if something happens with Farron, if she's in Hammerfall and something happens with Farron, like Farron hurts someone or she does something with the light, Thrall should have been there to prevent it and to tell Farron about why these Mag'har orcs don't like the light. And there should have been so much more nuance. There were so many cool things and good things and interesting and great things you could have done with this storyline, and it feels like you fall short. And it's a shame, because this could have been a really great thing. But I gave my opinion. I talked about why it is so bad. I talked about why it is so badly received, because I'm not the only one who has this opinion. And I also talked about how it could have been done better. So with that having said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comment section how you would have liked to see this story go out. And maybe there's other quest lines, I'm sure there's a ton of other quest lines that are about a certain faction or something that is just completely horrible that people can tell me about in the comment section. But Legacy of Arathor stuck out to me because I am a very big, I'm a very big Mag'har orc enjoyer. I'm a very big orc enjoyer in general, and I'm a sucker for that old world lore. So I would have loved to see them add more weight to it. But anyway, let me know in the comments. Leave a like to help boost this video up and let it reach a broader audience. Subscribe if you're new, because I'm gonna be trying to post more and more Warcraft videos and stuff like that on my channel. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.